Great. Good afternoon and welcome to this special live Hudson Institute event. I'm Ken Weinstein, the Walter P. Stern Distinguished Fellow at Hudson Institute, and I'm delighted to be joined by a team of Hudson Institute All-Stars. David Asher to my right here at the Betsy and Walter Stern Policy Center on Pennsylvania Avenue, Rebecca Heinrichs to my left, and behind me, Brian Clark and Bill Schneider, who are with us virtually for our panel on Thinking the Unthinkable, Part 2, What if Vladimir Putin wins in Ukraine? Now, the first Thinking the Unthinkable event we held with this esteemed group of colleagues was back in late March, and it focused on the question of whether Vladimir Putin might use weapons of mass destruction in Ukraine. In that panel, in the spirit of Hudson Institute founder Herman Kahn, thought to think through the most dangerous possibility out there in terms of the war in Ukraine for precisely the same reason Herman sought to think through the possibility of nuclear exchanges between the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War. That is to say, to think through the worst possibilities in order to help prevent them. And none of our panelists that day thought that the use of weapons of mass destruction was very likely, but we all thought that this most dangerous, most challenging scenario had to be examined in order to prevent it from taking place. Now we're back thinking through another dangerous scenario, another dangerous possibility, that of a significant change of momentum in the war in Ukraine leading to a Putin victory. And I think it's fair to say, although each of us has differing assessments of the direction of the war, we each think that it's fair to say that despite massive Ukrainian resistance 4 months into Putin's invasion of Ukraine, he is beginning, we're seeing, to consolidate some gains across about a fifth of Ukraine, focused in the east, obviously Donbas and surrounding areas, and in some parts of the Black Sea. Especially noteworthy is Russia stepping up its efforts in the east in Donbas, in Severodonetsk, in the key transport city of Kharkiv, and also keeping up his blockade of Ukraine's historic critical port city of Odessa, and heavily threatening Mykolaiv, a major port city of 500,000 before the war, as well as other southern Ukrainian ports, key entry points into the Black Sea, which are critical to wheat exports, food exports, fuel exports. So given the situation on the ground, and noting that this is not simply a military campaign, that it's also an economic, diplomatic, and political campaign as well, just want to open up with those remarks and first turn it over to Senior Fellow David Asher. He's got a PowerPoint presentation on how he sees the state and of play in Ukraine. Over to you, David.
Yeah, I'm just going to move relatively quickly, starting with the British Defense Intelligence latest map of the Russians' positions in the Ukraine. And you can see, as Ken said, how much they are consolidating in the east. They've had, of course, their position in Crimea in the south from 2014, but they really are, I believe, getting prepared to make a significant movement into the west toward Odessa. This is what Putin says is a sort of crowning objective. So far, what he said should be, he's more or less done what he said beyond taking Kiev, which he obviously failed. But his focus is on basically the economic strangulation of the Ukrainian economy, as far as I can see as an economist who works in military issues as well. Mykolaiv is under, not under siege, but it's under significant pressure from Russian artillery, and Russian forces are just, getting poised to make a larger move there. Kherson is essentially been taken, but there is resistance. Odessa is just being fired upon with missiles, but I mean, we're not talking at an enormous distance. And of course, this is why, and I know Rebecca and Brian and Bill will comment on it. We should be giving the long-range MLRS systems that we have, not the intermediate-range systems, so that the Ukrainians can protect Odessa at all costs. I mean, losing Odessa is the key seaport for the Ukrainian economy, and combined with the other losses so far, it would be just a total disaster and probably the end of the ability for the Ukrainians to, at least in any reasonable amount of time, displace the Russian advances that have been made. Next slide is just headlines from the newspapers. Russia being propelled by a flood of cash that could average $800 million a day, June 1st, Bloomberg. the fact the Russian federal budget surplus is rising significantly. Fossil fuel exports have been a key enabler of the Ukrainian military. They're skyrocketing in value. Okay, so even though there is an impact of sanctions, oil export prices have gone up, and so has oil revenue. Natural gas has skyrocketed. So is Putin actually economically winning? I'd say, despite his own braggadocio the other day declaring that he is, I hate to tell you, my estimate is he actually probably is prevailing, and certainly in his mind. And even if the Russian economy is suffering, there's still indicators that show that it remains relatively robust. Russia's current account deficits, the next slide, it's up. You can see it year on year. Imports from Russia have fallen, of course, in the United States, but elsewhere they're up. China, Euro area, they've been increasing. So we're not, or they've been decreasing, I guess, in the Euro area in not a significant way. Russian Russia's put natural gas futures through the roof. They've come down a bit recently due to the seasonal impact of, we're not in the winter, but the Russian ruble has continuously appreciated. The next slide is on European consumer confidence in natural gas. Consumer confidence in Europe is falling in the toilet, unfortunately, as natural gas prices spike. The next slide is just simply Russia's oil money being generated. You can see it's significantly up year on year. And then I'll just say that we can put these slides on the website. The overall impact, turning to the next two slides, the one after this one, please. What the Russians are doing is they're having a massive impact on global food prices. And this is a significant aspect that Putin will be able to leverage as he combines the Ukrainian and Russian grain exports to the world economy, which are in the 25% range of the total amount of exported grain available. He's going to be able to basically hold our sanctions accountable and basically say if we don't lift the sanctions, he's not going to allow exports of grain to go forward. So I'll just conclude on that. Let me just go to the slide number 13, which is just, actually there's this slide right before it, please. Just understand that inflation is one of the things that historically has broken down long economic cycles of prosperity in the world. And the major driver of inflation historically has been wars and pandemics and famines. And we have all of those going on right now. Putin knows it. So let's not forget that he can play a global economic game against us and as he expands his strategy forward. Thank you.
Great, thank you, David. Extremely insightful, a lot for us to digest. Let me turn it over to you, Brian, to get your sense of where you see the current state of play in Ukraine. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. And I'll build on David's comments and talk a little bit about what's happening on the ground and at sea. So now that Russia's been able to consolidate their troops and their territorial holdings down in the south and east, they've been able to go back to the playbook they originally had in the Donbas during the war between 2014 and today, which is they use their electromagnetic spectrum systems to find enemy troop locations, meaning Ukrainian troop locations, and then use that to guide artillery and rocket fire against those troops. And then they go indiscriminately and attack local civilian infrastructure. Once those troops and the civilian infrastructure is damaged or attrited, they just move up the artillery and the rockets to the next step, and they just keep grinding away in that manner and slowly accrete territory over time. So it's a very grinding, attritional form of warfare that they've got the luxury of being able to sustain because they're operating close to home. They've got interior lines of communication back to Russia. They have lots of rounds of ordnance to bring out there, and it doesn't require sophisticated weapons like we saw earlier in the war. So they've got a large inventory of these sort of relatively unsophisticated or unguided rockets and artillery. As a matter of fact, right now, they have about a 10 times firepower advantage over Ukraine in terms of how many shells they can throw across the front line versus how many shells the Ukrainians can throw back across. So at a 10-to-1 advantage, the Russians are just going to continue to overwhelm Ukrainian positions, drive them back, and move along towards Odessa, which, as David said, is their near-term objective in terms of being able to establish a hold over the entire southern coast of Ukraine and essentially make it a landlocked country. What this suggests, though, is that just giving Ukraine more artillery pieces and more rounds of ordnance is probably not the right way to go about this. We need to start equipping Ukraine to fight like NATO would have fought the Russians. We never planned to fight the Russians toe-to-toe in an artillery battle. We have never set up our militaries to do that because we understood that they were always going to have an advantage as the home team. So the idea was we were always going to use precision, networked forces, electromagnetic spectrum operations, cyber warfare to go after the Russians and target their key enablers, their logistics lines, their command and control centers, their sensors. Well, the Ukrainians can't do that. They're not equipped to do that. We need to start equipping them in a manner that allows them to fight like NATO would have fought had they fought the Russians, because at this point, they're essentially doing this as a proxy for the NATO forces. We should be equipping them to do that. Now at sea, the bigger problem is the Ukrainian blockade, or the blockade of Ukrainians' ports by Russian ships of the Black Sea Fleet. 22 to 24 Russian ships, including a half dozen submarines, are out there preventing Ukrainian exports from reaching market. We've done some very token efforts to support them by handing off some Harpoon cruise missiles from Denmark and also some Neptune cruise missiles that the Ukrainians had have been able to be employed. Neither one of those cruise missiles can reach more than about 70 miles, which means the 300-mile trip from Odessa to the Bosphorus Strait is mostly unprotected. So there's no way that Ukraine can break this blockade on their own. We need to equip them in a manner that allows them to protect their shipping all the way from Odessa to the Bosphorus. Otherwise, Putin is going to always have this ability to close off the food access for the world. Even if they negotiate a settlement and he opens up access to the Black Sea again, he can always close it off at his leisure, which allows him to use this as a valve to control the food flow to the rest of the world. And whenever he is unhappy with the negotiating position, the agreements that he's reached, he's going to do that, get a new series of concessions and move on. So really, we need to equip the Ukrainians to fight like NATO would have fought at sea and ashore. And there's paths to do that using unmanned systems, using some precision weapons, using longer range weapons, as David said. And we can talk about that a little bit more as we go. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian, for those characteristically insightful remarks. Bill, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. There's lots going on, as we can see, just as a footnote to Brian's observations about the struggle in the Black Sea. RFE-RL released some dramatic satellite images today of showing that Russia is transporting grain from southern Ukraine through Crimea to ships that then take the grain to favored allies. They have a particularly clear image of the shipping of grain to Syria, but about 500,000 tons have already been shipped, and that seems to be part of the Russian game plan. So also the media coverage is now pretty extensive and focusing on the aspirations of the key NATO players.
Domestic is very focused on as they communicate how they are interacting and engaging in support for Ukraine. And so it's very important that we understand truly what is happening. One point that Brian made, and we recently wrote a piece on how to help Ukraine win, and one of the points we made was all of the weapons supplies, much of it good that we support, it's not enough, it's not coming fast enough, it's not the higher capability, the more lethal weapon systems they need for the ground operation, but all of it will be for naught if we do not help Ukraine break the naval blockade. That is where we are. Odessa really is the key here. So Ukraine deserves great credit for being able to thwart the initial objective, which is a quick, sharp victory in the sack of Kyiv. They thwarted them from doing that. The Russians kind of moved in and changed their objectives, but now they are really focused on Odessa. It is absolutely possible for Russia to win this particular military objective, and so our military objective for Ukraine should be to do whatever is necessary to prevent Odessa from falling into the hands of Russia. And that means that we cannot hamstring Ukrainians in terms of their target sets, in terms of what they're able to do. And we need to give them the kinds of weapons that Brian mentioned specifically that will be necessary to achieve that objective. And then with that, I mean, I would humbly suggest that the U.S. government has been inclined to speak in very clear terms about what the United States is willing to do and not willing to do. This is a time probably to be quiet, to go quiet, and to simply state that We are committed to seeing Ukraine not go completely under the subjugation of the Russian Federation, because with Ukraine, especially Odessa, goes NATO's basically ability to control food security in Europe and to keep those ports open. And so I'll leave it at that and then turn to the conversation that Ken's going to lead us.
Thank you, Rebecca. We've had 4 superb presentations. Let me. It is funny because you look at the situation on the ground, and it was clear, a month ago, 2 months ago. Well, first you had Secretary Austin talking about an outright Ukrainian victory publicly, and then you also had a sense that the narrative, the Russians had lost the information war, and that Ukraine had obviously. Zelensky's done an amazing job rallying public support around the world, and not just in democratic countries, not just in Europe. And now we sort of see Russia using this economic tool in addition to, rattling the nuclear saber as well. How do you see, let's talk about the divisions within the Biden administration. I know this is a little bit of a shift. Where do you see the Biden team coming out? Where do you see divisions internally between those pushing for a stronger response, those pushing for diplomacy? What's your sense? Let me throw that out.
Well, the president sort of suggested there was going to have to be a diplomatic outcome just last week, and I think that's what his intention is. I think it's a horrible consequence of his inaction in the face of a tremendous stream of strategic intelligence going back over a year that Putin was seriously interested in doing this. If you read it, I was just reading Putin's speeches over the last few years last night. You can go back several years, and you can actually go back to 2007 to Munich, where you probably were in attendance, as maybe others were. I mean, he's sort of done what he's been saying, but the problem is, what else is he saying? He's talking about Kaliningrad, where Lithuania just implemented the sanctions against the Russians. Movement of goods into Kaliningrad, which is, obviously their key port that ties them into the Atlantic seaboard. I mean, this could get much worse if this, and I'm afraid the administration, in order to avoid so-called World War III, is actually precipitating the grounds of what could actually create a situation where we could end up in a World War III type situation. I would say Kaliningrad would certainly bring in NATO, at least in my estimation, and we'd be in all-out probable conflict with the Russians. So I'd like to certainly hear from Rebecca and Bill and Brian and Ken yourself. We got to expand our air cover. Maybe NATO should get involved in providing air cover to Odessa. Maybe at the very least we should be giving them every unmanned system we've got in the Mojave Desert, of which there's many. I've been out there not long ago. There's a whole ton of General Atomics, predators out there. I mean, we should be moving all of this in now, not waiting. And I'm afraid the administration has no intention of doing it. I don't think they've even really planned it.
Rebecca, and then I'll turn to Brian and Bill.
Sure. I would say I think that there is a differing view of how much the United States should contribute. I think that I don't even want to use the term sort of hawkish. I think that these folks are the ones that are being very realistic about what's at stake and understanding that sometimes you have to take on more risk early on so that you're not taking on enormous risk later on in the conflict. I think we're already there. If the United States had not telegraphed, unfortunately, weakness in the beginning, rather, for the sake of, being very fearful of escalation, our risk aversion actually caused escalation, just the escalation control on the part of the Russian Federation rather than the United States NATO effort. But I think that there are some people in there who understand. Let me just give you an example. So this was in the media reported on June 6th that Secretary Blinken was at a roundtable talking about food security, and he accused the Russian forces of planting explosives in captured farmland, hoarding Ukraine's food exports. So we're talking about a naval blockade. They are targeting food across the board. Secretary Blinken said Russian President Vladimir Putin is doing this, quote, aggressively using his propaganda machine to deflate or distort responsibility because he hopes it will get the world to give in to him and then the sanctions. In other words, quite simply put, it's blackmail, end quote. That was Secretary Blinken. So we do have individuals within the administration who seem to clearly have a clear-eyed view, but again, you have political considerations domestically that can cloud, I think, the judgments, and there's extreme bias against understanding what's going to happen in a hope that this might go away if we get a deal, with the Russians. But of course, peace at any cost is just going to be delayed warfare, much worse than we're probably already seeing it. So that how we end this conflict matters a great deal, and it can't be after the Russians capture Odessa.
And the domestic consequences being the inflation from fuel prices and food prices. That's the fear that a deal will.
So there is, my view has been inflation high, fuel prices are high, going into an election where individuals don't understand what the causes of all of these things are, and it's a confluence of all kinds of different events that are happening. Sure. And a lot of it, in my view, is the result of this administration's prioritization of green policies that have prevented them from doing things that could alleviate some of these problems. All that to say, they've got a domestic audience that clearly doesn't want to have a major war in Europe, but because of we've got domestic problems here, but not fully understanding that if you don't want a major war in Europe, you've got to do some things on the front end to deter a major war in Europe, and that's where I think this administration has not done so well.
Sure, Brian?
And to build on what Rebecca said, looking at the Kaliningrad example is a great one, because what's happening is you've got NATO members freelancing in an effort to try to do something, to slow down the Russian advance. And so Lithuania decides to close the Suwalki Gap to Russian imports to Kaliningrad. Well, Kaliningrad's part of Russia. It's not some remote outpost. So it'd be like Canada cutting Maine off from the rest of the United States. We wouldn't like that very much. So Russia will take some action against that. Well, that's the moral hazard then, is that now, Lithuania has brought NATO into a conflict with Russia because Lithuania was frustrated with the lack of activity on the part of NATO when it comes to Ukraine. So we have to be stronger with regard to what we're supporting Ukraine with to try to prevent these kinds of freelancer operations from happening in the future, because it will continue. So giving them the weapons they need in order to hold back the Russian advance is going to be essential. And it doesn't have to be necessarily NATO coming in and fighting on behalf of the Ukrainians. They are more than capable of fighting for themselves, but we need to equip them in a way that allows them to fight differently than how they're having to fight right now. I think there's a lot to be said for going after Russian logistics that are coming in from the Russian territory proper through the Donbas to the front lines over close to Crimea and Odessa. Going after those logistics lines with longer range guided missiles, even maybe ATACMS, which is the longer range version of Gimlers that David referred to, and then using unmanned aircraft like the Predator or the Gray Eagles that we said we were going to give to Ukraine would be ways to go after those logistics lines and reestablish some of the conditions that happened around Kyiv when the Russians had difficulty getting their logistics all the way to Kyiv and as a result bogged down. Well, we need to bog them down in the east as well. Otherwise, you're going to continue to have this effort by some NATO countries to do something to push back on Russia in their own regions, which is likely to perpetuate some conflict there. Thanks.
Thank you. Bill?
These are excellent points, and I think underscore the earlier discussion about the way in which U.S. choices have permitted Russia to control escalation rather than us controlling escalation. We are supposed to be in the deterrence business, and we're not. We're allowing Russia to do so, and the failure to provide unmanned aerial systems is really perhaps the most fundamental bad choice. The Air Force has more than 300 of the MQ-9 Reaper aircraft that it no longer wants in its inventory. We have the Army has large numbers of the Gray Eagle, but to refuse to provide it because an agency within the DoD is concerned about the compromise of the technology in the aircraft suggests something other than technology security. It's part of this broad reluctance to enable Ukraine to win, and it's likely to have the kind of consequences Brian referred to.
Bill, can I ask you, is that decision being made at the DoD level, at the White House level? What's your sense?
Well, it's the technology security decision was made by the Defense Technology Security Administration, but the Secretary has the authority to overrule it. and this is frequently done in the interest of serving U.S. national security ends. So this decision is more likely to reflect the broader decision on the part of the administration to squeeze Ukraine's capacity so that they lose more slowly, so that a diplomatic solution can be posed that would oblige Ukraine to give up some of its territory.
Yeah, let me ask you, Bill. Let me turn to you first this time in the round of questions. So last week we saw the trip to Kiev by French President Macron, German Chancellor Scholz, and Italian Prime Minister Draghi, arguably the three Western leaders who have been arguably the least in favor of sort of the all-out victory in Ukraine option. The talks with Zelensky led to a promise of EU candidacy for Ukraine, which is something that Ukraine wants. What's your sense of what's behind those talks, and what they discussed, and what the Biden administration's relation to what happened in these talks is? If you have a sense on that.
Those three countries are perhaps the most vulnerable to Russian blackmail on energy, because all three of them get more than 40% of their energy from Russia, and I think they're looking at pretty much a train wreck to their economy once the demands for fuel or energy are accelerated. The U.S. is not prepared to increase supply because it conflicts with the aims that climate envoy Kerry has expressed for a green future. As a result, we're not going to help Europe with increased natural gas production, which could readily be done if we chose to do so. So the convergence of these things, as Rebecca was also pointing to, is creating a situation where grave damage to our national security is likely to be a consequence.
Any other thoughts on the trip by the European leaders to Kyiv?
Nothing specifically about the trip, but on the broader point about allies, I would just say this ties in with something that Brian just said too about other NATO allies that are going to start acting out on their own too. This is why U.S. leadership is so important. You have a very different view of what needs to happen across the alliance. Obviously, those that were closer to the Russian violence, military aggression, imperialism, want a much more robust. They understand the security threat, and they also have assessed that Ukraine will. That's not where Russia will stop if they are not stopped. That the Putin will continue to go, and so you have the Western, some of the other allies having a very different assessment, and then aims. And then when you have a breakdown and you don't have strong leadership provided by the United States, you're going to have these other countries making decisions that they believe are in their best interest. They're frustrated. The Poles are similarly situated. I just got back from Warsaw, had a lot of great conversations with the folks out there who, the language that they use when they talk about the Russian threat is they understand that this is an imperialist mission, that this is not going to stop with Ukraine if the Russians are not stopped in Ukraine. And so, of course, the same thing is going to happen with Lithuania and these other countries. And then one more thing is, these other countries that are in the region have been warning the United States, and this is not just to say, it's kind of a funny thing to make a comment, I guess, in the midst of this, but we should have been paying attention. This was all predictable for years. The Romanians have been sounding the alarm bell about the militarization of the Black Sea for years, and so we should have seen this coming. But again, now is the time to stop it and to do what is necessary. And one last point I would make, Brian had talked to, and Bill had mentioned the kinds of weapon systems that they need. The American people sort of believe that we have sent tens of billions of dollars to Ukraine, but really, according to a fact sheet by the DoD just sent out very recently, less than $7 billion actually goes towards the military effort that the United States has pledged to Ukraine. The rest of it is economic aid and other things for USAID. So I think it's important to understand too, to Brian's point, there's a lot more the United States can be providing that we have available to arm and equip the Ukrainians to do what they are able to do if they had the ability to do it.
Can I just jump in with one
Yeah,
thing?
yeah.
So there's something else we could be doing. We have the world's greatest military in the Pacific. We could be stirring up trouble in the Russian Far East right now to create a problem for Putin. I think that the idea of us playing this sort of, go straight up the middle, follow the rules of the road thing is ridiculous. We need to be engaged in an unconventional or regular warfare effort to try to complicate his battle picture, that it's not going to lead to escalation. This is what we did in the Cold War. Undersecretary Schneider was deeply involved in it, and I think it'd be great to get his perspective. But I mean, we were going head to head with the Russians in the Far East day in and day out from in the mid 1980s all the way up to the end of the fall of the wall when I was first getting involved in Asia. I mean, we're not doing things which will complicate his picture. And I think it's increasing his cockiness and confidence. And that's why I'm so worried about him making a move, even if it seems sort of tactically ridiculous, sort of like Kaliningrad or something. Sure. He's capable of expanding. And let's not forget, he hasn't mobilized his full population under 40. There's a huge number of people that haven't been called up, okay? So like, he's just sort of hit the front lines of people called up. He's welcomed older people to sign up again who've got battle-hardened capabilities. But he hasn't fully mobilized his population, and he can. So what we need to do is to start to use NATO, if not to do Overwatch over Odessa, at least we should be providing unmanned systems and other capabilities directly. And then let's not forget about all the, what I'll call the third offset capabilities we have, which we can't talk about. Sure. But I think the Russians have some idea that there exists. And if there's ever a time to start to unveil certain things to throw off his sort of sense of mojo, it's right now. I don't think we should wait. Invisible deterrence is not deterrence.
Brian, let me turn it over to you for comments on that.
Yeah, so I think David brings up a great point. One of the things we have to start thinking about in terms of great power competition is not just deterring through threats of denial, right? That ship has sailed. It doesn't seem like denial is really deterring folks anymore. We need to start thinking about how do we dissuade them from conflict, because we start creating enough uncertainty regarding their lack of or their likelihood of success, start undermining their confidence in their plans, start making them think twice about their day-to-day stability. Those kinds of actions, can be used to dissuade an adversary like Russia. We did that during the Cold War. Bill can talk about that, but we built the kinds of playbooks and executed them to make the Soviets feel like they weren't completely sure that the plans they had for taking over Europe, for example, were going to work on terms that would be acceptable to them. So those are the kinds of things we could be doing today, and it's not something you have to talk about. You want to communicate that to the target via the means that make the most sense for whatever the action is. But those are actions we should be taking in concert with equipping Ukraine to fight the way that NATO would have fought.
Okay, thank you. Let me turn to the question of the upcoming NATO summit in Madrid in a week and the new NATO strategic concept. Rebecca talked about her trip to Poland. I was recently in the Czech Republic for a transatlantic security workshop, which had a number of officials from a number of countries, and was interesting to see the discussions about Germany and the frustration about Germany that the periphery countries feel, which is deep, it is intense, and it's significant. Now, this past Sunday in the Bild am Sonntag, NATO General Secretary Stoltenberg mentioned that the war in Ukraine could last years. It was his term. And as we head into this the summit, there is a possibility. There seems to be, the Biden team seems to be putting pressure more on the diplomatic solution as we're going in. This is not the same. The tenor of this NATO summit is not going to be the same as the special session that was held back, I guess it was in March. Bill, what's your sense of the direction of NATO, what NATO needs to do, and what impact that might have in the medium term in Ukraine?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot that can be done by NATO, and certainly in the military sphere, as Brian suggested, there are things that could be done. The biggest thing that could be done that can strengthen NATO solidarity and collaboration in this matter is for the U.S. energy policy to facilitate the lifting of oil and gas and shipping that to Europe to deprive Russia of their ability to blackmail the three main countries of Europe. And in doing so, disrupt the unity that the president has otherwise been very successful in achieving at a diplomatic level. So I think the high value issue is a combination of energy policy that blunts the Russian blackmail threat, the provision of airborne assets to open the Black Sea to commerce, and then the provision of related NATO capabilities, as Brian suggested, to Ukraine that would enable them to defeat Russia's efforts to take over Ukraine.
Great questions, thoughts, yeah.
No, I would just, so the one point I'd make on that is, I mean, you know, for years people wonder why Turkey is a part of NATO. Well, this is why Turkey's part of NATO. We really need Turkey to help us get the Black Sea opened up and get grain flowing back through there. And so that's a very critical role that Turkey can play. As a matter of fact, when I was back in Bucharest talking with the Romanians and others several years ago, I think it was 2018, this was something that they constantly reminded me to sort of admonish me whenever I would be too harsh with my criticisms of Turkey, is this is why you want them inside the team and not on the outside of the team. And so, and we've got a great scholar here, Mike Duran, who can speak really well on that particular issue. But wanted to put that on the table, and then just say that again, just to hammer on this point, the United States needs to actually have a leadership role here. So I agree with Ken's point that there is a weariness and a pressure to have peace, but it cannot be peace at any cost. It has to be on peace on terms most favorable to Ukraine. When Ukraine has just scored the military victories, if you do it right after these series of tactical, which are really amounting to strategic victories that favor Russia, then essentially you've just lost the entire campaign to the Russians with major strategic consequences.
Let's turn the page and now talk about China in the few minutes that remain. I was recently in Japan, met with a Japanese official who said, look, no one is watching what's going on in Ukraine more closely than Xi Jinping. What lessons does he take away, David?
Well, I don't think he's taken away the lesson that he shouldn't try to take control of Taiwan. I think it's sobered up his military leaders as to the costs of a direct invasion. But I've been focused, and I was the senior official in the East Asia Bureau who was able to go to Taiwan when I was senior advisor. So I wasn't the assistant secretary, deputy assistant secretary. So I was able to go there, and I went there very frequently during the Bush administration. And one thing that we've not focused on is China's irregular warfare capability, covert action capability in Taiwan. Okay, there's an awful lot that they could do to disrupt Taiwan state and society under the table. I think that there's plenty of ambitions to do that, and the military would essentially be a reserve force for that. They would come in to protect whatever disruption occurred in the event that we tried to help facilitate the reversion of it. So let's not, and why does that matter to everybody in the United States? It's called semiconductors, okay? We've got something on the order of, 52% of the semiconductors in the world that we consume are coming from Taiwan. The total amount from Asia is higher than that. It's over about 80%. And of course, China's ability to use that as a tool of economic warfare, much like Putin is using oil, natural gas, and food. You combine these things, what you get is literally maybe the most pernicious inflation we've had in world history. I mean, people just don't understand the cascading effects of the recovery of COVID, the shutdown of COVID, and the recovery, the massive monetary impulse from the Fed, and all the European and Asian central banks, and then the threat of an economic related conflict in Asia that would cut us off from our critical source of supply for electronics, microelectronics, which is Taiwan. This could turn into an absolute global disaster, and that would be a prelude to some sort of world war, in my mind.
Brian, over to you.
Yeah, I think that the Chinese have certainly taken some lessons from the Ukraine invasion. It's going to be more difficult to take Taiwan than they may have thought. I think any analysis I've been involved in of the China-Taiwan fight has shown that it's a very tough slog once you get on the ground. And I don't think that China ever thought it was going to be a cakewalk. I do think, though, that they're starting to rethink, the utility of other scenarios to try to bring Taiwan back into the fold. So, as David said, irregular warfare, blockade, quarantine. Doing the same kind of thing that to Taiwan as we did to Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's a lot of approaches that China could take that are going to be more antiseptic, if you will, that for them than trying to go the ground invasion route. And that might be something they reserve as an absolute last resort. And I think the Ukraine invasion kind of highlighted that for them. But that for us, that's a challenge, because now that means that other scenarios are going to be on the table to a degree they may not have been before, which drives a different set of military demands for the U.S. that we may have not been preparing for to the same degree, because we've been building our forces around this one canonical scenario of the China-Taiwan invasion. So we need to start rethinking other options like a blockade, and what kind of military do we need to counter a Chinese blockade of Taiwan, or deal with a Chinese bombardment of Taiwan that happens over the course of months or years.
Bill, your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a very pertinent question, and I think we should bear in mind that China has been conspicuously unsuccessful in its assault on its various neighbors over time. The Russians beat them up in '69 in the struggle in the Amur River, Damansky Island. The Korean War was not a success for them. They tried to beat up the Vietnamese in '79. That failed. They lost the Indo-Chinese war in 1962, where they attempted to grab some of India's territory. So China does not have a good track record of trying to pressure its neighbors through a military power. One of the things that may be a consideration here is China's recent shift to a massive increase in its nuclear capability. We've witnessed for more than a decade, China increasing its conventional power and its increasing focus on electronics and data and so forth. But it's a shift in the last 2 years to a massive increase in land-based ICBMs, mobile land-based ICBMs, full range of medium and intermediate range missiles, and a rapid pace of modernization of their nuclear forces suggests that perhaps they are going to have a different path as they try to influence the outcome with Taiwan than either the classic invasion that we've been concerned about, or perhaps not even with subversion, but try to use their regional nuclear preponderance as a means of leverage.
Rebecca.
I would just say, too, I appreciate the question, because every conversation about what is going on geopolitically with Russia and Europe needs to fit into the larger context of what the PRC is thinking. The PRC has backed, and what I mean by that is it is supportive of Russia's war against Ukraine and wants Russia to be successful. There are some analysts who think that China is sort of secretly hoping that Russia fails. That doesn't at all make any sense to me at all. China wants Russia to prevail, for Russia to weaken NATO, and that fits in with the PRC's larger aims, which of course is to take Taiwan, be able to push the United States out of the Indo-Pacific, and then expand its aims even beyond that particular region. So, I mean, one point that I would just hammer home is that we, the United States, needs to be looking to see what have we failed to do with Ukraine, and what do we need to be doing very, very on an aggressive timetable to make sure that we don't get too comfortable with hoping that the PRC has taken the right lessons, that they would be unsuccessful in taking Taiwan. We should be doing all the things to convince the Chinese now that we would complicate and their war aims, and so we should be aggressively arming Taiwan. Now we should be doing the things we need to harden, to be able to fight for and fight from Guam and other U.S. territories in the region, so that we can project force and power. All of this is meant to convince the PRC that, again, any aim that they have still doesn't make sense, then that the cost would simply be far too high for what the United States and our allies in the region will be able to bring to bear as a penalty to their attempts to take Taiwan in whatever method they decide to do it. So that needs to be a lesson learned. And then also, it is true that we can't, that we are running out of certain kinds of weapon systems. For instance, the Stinger weapon, which has been great in Ukraine, that doesn't have a warm line. If we run out of that, we run out of that. And so we're looking to replace the Stinger missile, and the Taiwanese want Stinger. But the lesson is not then to give up on Ukraine so that we can focus on Taiwan. That would be the horrifically wrong answer. The answer is we need to have an industrial-based capability so that we can produce at scale the weapons necessary to handle the kinds of threat the United States of America faces today, and not just the kinds of threats and the wars that we would prefer to have, but just the reality that we have, which is that we have the PRC and the Russian Federation, essentially a de facto alliance cooperative effort to undermine the United States in our alliance architectures that we have both in Europe and the Middle East, and then also in the Indo-Pacific.
Great. Okay, superb way to end what's been an absolutely remarkable panel. I want to thank my colleagues, David Asher, Rebecca Heinrichs here, Brian Clark, and Bill Schneider virtually. Hudson Institute has been thinking the unthinkable since July 7th, 1961. Glad to see the tradition is alive and well. Sorry to see that global affairs requires us to do that, but so be it. Looking forward to perhaps a third panel, God willing, a few months out on Thinking the Unthinkable Part 3. Thank you very much, and thank you to the public affairs team here at Hudson for pulling the event together.